This week has been good bipartisan cooperation and a string of
Go check out any YouTube video where a member of Congress is having a senior moment. Go down to the comments and you will see tons of people calling for term limits. And it makes sense. When a member of Congress is having trouble keeping track of what planet they're on, it's not just a problem for their constituents, it's a problem for all of us. And there is no question that term limits would lead to a significantly more youthful Congress. But here's the thing, political scientists really don't like term limits. They point out that being a member of Congress is a really tough job, and most people get better at it as they get more experience. They say that if somebody's willing to continue to serve at an age when most people would be retired, and if their voters think they're up to the job, then we ought to let them try. Now, this is a complicated issue, and I'm not going to tell you that you should agree with one side or the other. What I want to do is tell you a story that will, I hope, help you to see where both sides are coming from. Because there's one guy whose career is at the same time the very best argument for having people spend basically their entire adult lives in Congress, and also the very best argument against it. Sometimes I like to imagine that there's a Congress Hall of Fame, like they've got for basketball or baseball. And to get into this Hall of Fame, it's not about being a good person. It's not about fighting for good causes. It's all about how good are you at getting what you want out of the legislative process. And if we had a Hall of Fame like this, there is no question that Ted Kennedy would have gotten in his first year of eligibility. Because when it comes to passing bills under difficult circumstances, Ted Kennedy is one of the best to ever do it. You would not have expected that at the start of his career. When he first ran for Senate in 1962, he was running for his older brother JFK's old seat. And in the very first debate, his opponent pointed at him and said that he had graduated from law school 3 years ago, that he had never worked for a living, that he had never held elected office, and
if his name was Edward Moore, with his qualifications, with your qualifications, Teddy, if it was Edward Moore, your candidacy would be a joke. But nobody's laughing. Nobody's laughing. Nobody's laughing because his name is not Edward Moore. It's Edward Moore Kennedy.
He's saying that the only reason he's a factor in the race at all is that his last name is Kennedy. Flat out called him a Nepo baby. And here's the thing, Kennedy's opponent was actually taking it easy on him because he didn't even mention that Kennedy had gotten kicked out of Harvard for cheating. But I guess it's a pretty big advantage if your brother's the president of the United States and your dad's one of the richest men in the country, because Kennedy won the election in a landslide. That was not the last time that Kennedy would get to play by different rules than the rest of us. Late one night in July of 1969, he left a party in Chappaquiddick, Massachusetts, with a young woman named Mary Jo Kopechne. She was a staffer on his brother's presidential campaign. He drove the two over a bridge where he lost control of the car and crashed into a nearby pond. We don't know exactly what happened next, but here's what we do know. Kennedy swam away, returned to the party, discussed what to do with his lawyer friends, returned to the scene of the accident, tried to rescue Kopechne, gave up, returned to the cottage, went to sleep, woke up, discussed what to do with some more lawyers and also with some political advisors, and then finally, at least 8 hours after the accident, reported it to the police. After the overturned car had already been spotted by passerby, and after a rescue diver had already recovered Kopechne's lifeless body. And here's what Kennedy had to say about it.
My conduct and conversations during the next several hours, to the extent that I can remember them, make no sense to me at all.
If that was the best excuse that you or I could come up with, we'd go to jail. Ted Kennedy got his driver's license suspended and served in the United States Senate for another 40 years. And if you think Chappaquiddick was just one bad night in Kennedy's life, think again. Back in the 80s and 90s, female congressional staffers maintained a list of predators. One of them explained, you got to know which senators you didn't want to be on an elevator alone with. Guess who was on that list? Ted Kennedy was, as best I can tell, a bad man. And to be honest, it kind of messes up the point about term limits that I'm trying to make in this video, because you can make a very good argument that Ted Kennedy didn't belong in the Senate at any age, given his character. Forget about the damage that he did when he's older. I'm trying to tell this story about the trade-offs for staying in office for a really long time, and Kennedy's moral character injects this really fascinating question in its own right about whether a bad person can be a great statesman. And if that's the lens through which you want to view the rest of this video, that's fine. I think that's actually an interesting question. You're going to get a lot of ammunition on both sides there too. But if you're interested in the question we started with, this question of whether it's a good thing to have people that serve in Congress for basically their whole lives, I'm going to ask you to put aside Kennedy the man and focus on Kennedy the politician. Because as a legislator, he was a magician. If you have HIV and can't afford treatment, there is a government program that will help you get medication. Economists estimate that this program has saved 57,000 lives. That program comes from the Ryan White Care Act, a Kennedy bill. If you have a mobility impairment, you might have taken advantage of handicap parking spots or used those cuts in the curbs to cross the street. Those are there because of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. The ADA is the Ted Kennedy bill. If you're a parent and you can't afford health insurance for your kids, but you make too much money to qualify for Medicaid, you can get free or heavily discounted health coverage for your kids through a program called CHIP. Today, 7 million children have health insurance through this program. That is a Ted Kennedy bill. If you're a member of Congress, you've had a very good career if you can pass just one or two bills that touch millions of people's lives. Ted Kennedy had dozens. And here's the really special part. Every single one of those bills that I just told you about passed while either there was a Republican president or there was a Republican majority in the Senate. Ted Kennedy was one of the most liberal senators for the years that he served. But for every one of his major accomplishments, he was able to get large numbers of Republicans to go along. And here's another interesting fact, apropos our discussion about term limits. Every single bill that I told you about, and every single bill that has scrolled through the screen while I've been talking, was passed after Kennedy had already served 20 years in the Senate. If we had term limits, none of these things would have happened. Passing bills is really hard, and it takes some time to get good at it. If you want to pass a bill, you need to know more about that subject than just about anyone in Washington, D.C. Because the moment you try to pass a bill, a bunch of lobbyists are going to come busting through the windows and crawling out of the toilets, telling everyone why your bill is such a terrible idea. And to be clear, this is a really important part of the process. Most bills that members of Congress come up with are terrible ideas. If a bill is going to cause thousands of jobs to get outsourced to Mexico or cause the mortgage interest rate to double, that's something that we need to know before we pass it. But as a result, if you want to pass a bill, you need to be able to win the argument against the lobbyists. And the lobbyists really know their stuff, so that means that you need to know your stuff too. Kennedy loved getting into the really fine details of policy. Let me give you an example. About once a week, Kennedy would have people over for dinner at his mansion. He would invite the very top experts in some issue that he was interested in, and also a couple members of Congress who he knew would be influential if he wanted to pass a bill in that area. And he'd get them all around the table, and they would talk about the issue for hours. What are the big problems? What are the solutions that are on the table? What do the different political players think about all those different options? And then he would do the same thing the next week. Same issue, totally different set of experts. And then he'd do it again and again and again until eventually he knew more than just about anyone on that issue. And then he'd move on to the next one. I did this over and over again for decades. But what really sets Kennedy apart from all the policy nerds is that he was not just great at the technical aspects of policymaking, he was really good at the relational aspects. People loved Ted Kennedy. Even Lyndon Johnson, who famously hated both Jack and Bobby Kennedy, loved Teddy. And it's easy to see why. Kennedy was a people person. He wanted to know about their lives, about their families, about their interests. If something good happened to them, he'd want to congratulate them. If they were sick, he'd want to come visit them in the hospital. Kennedy was friends with everybody, including the Republicans. And this is a really important part of how Kennedy managed to be so effective. Because if you're trying to work with somebody who you disagree with, it helps a heck of a lot if they liked you. If you want a great example of how the expertise and the relationships that Kennedy had came together, there was this episode where Kennedy was trying to pass a stem cell research bill. And he needed a Republican partner to go along with it. Who do you pick? Well, probably one of the last people you would think to ask would be Strom Thurmond, the South Carolina arch conservative who was fiercely pro-life. But Kennedy happened to know that stem cell research was a very promising avenue for treating juvenile diabetes. And because he was personally very close to Senator Thurmond, he happened to know that Thurmond's daughter had juvenile diabetes. That gave Kennedy everything he needed. He got Thurmond on board, and once Strom Thurmond was on board, all of these other Republicans who were worried about whether supporting a stem cell research bill would make them look bad with their pro-life constituents could look at Thurmond and say, well, geez, he's as pro-life as anybody, and if he's for the bill, it must really not be that bad. So hopefully now you can see how serving for years and years allows a legislator to cultivate all this expertise and develop all these relationships that allow them to do things in the legislative process that other legislators just can't do. Those are the advantages for letting a legislator serve for years and years. Now let's talk about the disadvantages. Ted Kennedy wrote a letter to President Obama to tell him that you will be the president who at long last signs into law the healthcare reform that is the great unfinished business of our society. Affordable health coverage will be available to all in an America where the state of a family's health will never again depend on the amount of a family's wealth. Kennedy had good reason to be optimistic. In the 2008 elections, Democrats won one of the biggest victories in their party's history. Obama was elected the president, the Democrats won a huge majority in the House of Representatives, and most important of all, Democrats won a 60-vote majority in the Senate. 60 is the number of votes that you need to break a filibuster. So if one party has 60 votes, they can pass bills without needing any support from the other side. This setup, where one party is able to pass legislation without any votes from the other party, almost never happens. The last time it happened was in the 1960s. Even with these huge majorities, everyone knew that it would be really hard to reform the healthcare system. It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry, there are millions of jobs at stake, the laws around it are really complicated, and oh yeah, if you screw it up, people will die. But the Democrats had an ace up their sleeves. They had a guy who had reformed the healthcare system multiple times, who had been preparing for this exact moment for his entire adult life. The maestro from Massachusetts, Ted Kennedy. There was just one problem. In May of 2008, Ted Kennedy had been diagnosed with brain cancer. Remember that letter that I read from a minute ago? When Kennedy wrote it, he knew he was dying. While I will not be there when it happens, you will be the president who at long last signs into law the healthcare reform that is the great unfinished business of our society. Now, if you were 76 years old and you were diagnosed with brain cancer, I'll bet you would probably say something like, well, I guess 46 years of service in the Senate is enough for one lifetime. I think I'll retire and I'll spend what time I have left trying to help my successor get up to speed. But that's not what Kennedy did. Not only did he refuse to resign his seat in the Senate, he also stayed on as the chairman of one of the two committees that was going to be responsible for the healthcare reform bill. The guy had brain cancer. He couldn't even come to Capitol Hill most of the time. He had to do most of his work over the telephone, and that was only when he wasn't too busy getting brain surgery or chemotherapy. He died in August of 2009, 3 months after he penned that letter to Obama. He was, at the time of his death, still a United States Senator. And when you consider how much of his life Kennedy devoted to the progressive cause, what happened next is absolutely tragic. The special election to replace Ted Kennedy was held on January of 2010. This was expected to be a walk for Democrats. Massachusetts was one of the most reliably Democratic states in the country, and it hadn't elected a Republican senator in over 30 years. 2 weeks before the election, the polls showed the Democratic candidate was up by 9 to 15 points. But then, as the election got closer, something unexpected happened. The gap in the polls vanished. Part of it was the candidates. The Democrat, Martha Coakley, was a terrible candidate. When she was criticized for spending too much time in D.C. fundraising, she said, "As opposed to standing outside Fenway Park, in the cold, shaking hands? Yes, you idiot, you're a candidate for public office. That's exactly what you're supposed to do." And then she managed to make it even worse. When the Red Sox's star pitcher, Curt Schilling, endorsed her opponent, she called him another Yankee fan. Those are fighting words in Boston. Her opponent, Scott Brown, was an excellent candidate. In his 20s, Cosmo magazine had named him America's sexiest man. But I think the timing of the election was even more important than the candidates. If Ted Kennedy had resigned when he was diagnosed with brain cancer, the special election would have been held in 2008. And yeah, Martha Coakley was a bad candidate, but if the election was in 2008, she totally would have won. 2008 was a great year to run as a Democrat. But Kennedy didn't resign when he was diagnosed. He held on to his office until he died. And that pushed the special election to 2010, which, the world would soon find out, was one of the very worst years to run as a Democrat in the party's entire history. You see, there was this protest movement that was brewing. Conservatives were boiling mad about what the Obama administration was doing and about its new healthcare law in particular. Today we know this as the Tea Party. And on January 19th, the Tea Party won the first and biggest victory in the movement's entire history. They got a Republican elected to Ted Kennedy's old Senate seat. Scott Brown's win sent a shockwave through Washington. With his election, Democrats no longer had a 60-vote majority in the Senate, which meant that Republicans could block their bills by filibustering them. That once-in-a-generation window for Democrats to pass bills without any Republican input had closed. And from the liberal perspective, the consequences of that window's premature closure would be titanic. Let's start with healthcare. One of the big questions in this healthcare reform debate was whether the bill would allow the federal government to start selling health insurance. This is called the public option because it would allow the public to buy insurance from the government instead of the private market. Liberals really like the public option because it could help people who can't afford to buy health insurance on the private market to get coverage. Conservatives really don't like the public option because they're afraid the government would sell health insurance for less than it costs to provide. This would drive private insurers out of business and lead to a government takeover of the healthcare system. Just before Scott Brown got elected, the House had passed a liberal healthcare reform bill with the public option in it, and the Senate had passed a more moderate healthcare reform bill with no public option. Now, before a bill can be sent to the president for signature and then to become law, it has to be passed in the exact same form by both the House and the Senate. So the next step was for the House and the Senate to get together and negotiate a compromise that combined their two bills. The number one priority for liberals in this negotiation was to make sure that that compromise bill had the public option in it. Scott Brown's election killed any chance of that happening, which is ironic because the number one supporter of the public option in the Senate had been Ted Kennedy. And the damage spread well beyond healthcare. Democrats had a campaign finance reform bill that was very much like the bill they tried to pass under the Biden administration, failed by one vote. Scott Brown's vote. And that's just the clearest example. There were a ton of other bills that Democrats were working on that if they had just had more time with their 60-vote majority, they probably could have gotten at least some of them passed. But because Scott Brown got elected and that window closed, they didn't pass. And depending on your point of view, maybe that's a good thing. My point here isn't to say whether public policy would have been better or worse if Ted Kennedy had resigned as soon as he got that brain cancer diagnosis. My point here is that Ted Kennedy's refusal to give up power had a massive influence on the way things went. And in this particular episode, it happens to have been the Democrats who came out behind. But given the age of a lot of the leading Republicans, it is not at all hard to imagine a scenario where the same kind of thing could set back conservative causes. To be fair to Congress, most people do have a pretty good idea of when their time is up, and they retire long before they become physically unable to do the job anymore. Just this year, we had Gary Peters announce his retirement at the relatively young age of 66, right when he was at the top of his game. Just last year, the Center for Effective Lawmaking rated him the top Senate Democrat. Kathy McMorris Rodgers, one of the top Republicans in the House, retired last year at the age of 55. But there are people like Kennedy who don't take their cue when it's time for them to go. And interestingly, a pretty high proportion of the people who overstay their welcome were, in their primes, some of the all-time greats. And you kind of have to wonder whether some of those qualities that made them great legislators in the first place, the tenacity, the optimism, the commitment to public service, the love of the game, the sense of connection with the institution and with the people in it, you have to wonder whether some of those virtues turn into vices when it's time to give it up. Maybe those very qualities that made them great also make it hard to walk away. How do you balance the good that a legislator can do by staying in office for years and years against the harm they can do by holding on to power for too long? I don't know, but hopefully by watching this video, no matter which side you fall on, you can see the other perspective a little bit better now than you could before. That's all for today. Let me know what you think about this term limits issue in the comments, and if you liked the video, be sure to subscribe so that you'll get a notification when the next one comes out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.